Asserting central dominion immediately, d4 opens diagonals for bishop and queen while preparing for knight development. Unleashing the knight to contest central influence, this move immediately signals an intention for flexible development and potential counterplay. Asserting central space, this pawn push immediately contests the d5 square, laying the groundwork for a potential queenside expansion. Preparing to fianchetto the bishop, black aims for a kingside blockade and long-range influence across the long diagonal, a classic response to this central setup. Developing the knight naturally controls central squares and prepares castling, enhancing kingside safety. Developing the bishop to g7 perfectly complements the fianchetto setup, controlling the long diagonal and preparing for kingside castling. Seizing the center with this pawn thrust solidifies white's central pawn presence, creating immediate spatial advantage and opening lines for future piece activity. Solidifying central presence, this pawn advances to contest the e4 square, preparing for potential pawn breaks and adding defensive support to the knight. Solidifying the central pawn structure, this develops a piece harmoniously, preparing for kingside castling while maintaining flexibility. Securing the monarch's safety is paramount, now freeing up pieces for active engagement on the flanks. Solidifying the center and preparing for kingside expansion, nf3 supports the pawn chain while opening diagonals for potential development. Boldly challenging white's central pawn structure, black immediately injects dynamism into the game by opening lines for their pieces and seizing the initiative in the d5 square. This pawn sacrifice, while creating immediate tactical possibilities, requires careful calculation to ensure the center doesn't collapse. The immediate fight for space dictates the game's complexion from this moment forward. Anchoring the center with the castled king, white seeks to consolidate control of the central squares, preparing for a potential pawn thrust in the middle game and ensuring king's safety in anticipation of potential piece exchanges. Solidifying the central pawn structure, black reinforces their e5 spearhead, preventing immediate pressure and offering a flexible knight development that eyes the kingside and potentially prepares for a queenside expansion. Solidifying the central pawn structure and preparing to potentially eye the queenside or central files, this placement readies for further development and offers support for the knight if it ventures to d5. Aggressively challenging white's center with the knight, this maneuver instantly injects tension, aiming to disrupt the pawn structure and potentially exploit any weakened squares around the white king. Activating the bishop towards the knight on g4 creates immediate pressure, aiming to disrupt black's central pawn structure and potentially exploit the compromised g-file. Retreating the bishop allows white to consolidate their central pawn mass, potentially preparing a kingside pawn storm with f4 and g4, while black's pieces are somewhat awkwardly placed after the recent maneuvers, and the knight on g4 might soon find itself a target. Clearing the bishop diagonal for the queen and opening the g-file offers white a dynamic opportunity to exploit black's slightly uncoordinated pieces. This exchange, while simplifying, fundamentally alters the pawn structure and promises an active middle game. Reclaiming the pawn and reintegrating the knight to a central outpost, black seeks to solidify their pawn structure and contest white's central occupation. This maneuver, though it relinquishes the bishop's diagonal influence, prepares for potential pawn breaks later and reactivates the knight, preventing white from gaining too much space. It's a positional adjustment aimed at balancing piece activity and structural integrity. Pushing the d-pawn here seizes central space, creating a pawn chain that aims to restrict black's knight and bishop and potentially open lines for white's pieces on the kingside. This advance challenges the pawn on e5, forcing black to commit to its defense or consider a counterthrust, and it prepares the way for further central expansion or a queenside minority attack down the line. Gaining central space is now a key objective for white after the pawn thrust, so black seeks to contest this by repositioning the knight. The knight from f6, having been exchanged off, finds a new home on e7, aiming to support the d5 pawn and potentially join the fight for the center from a slightly more reserved position. This maneuver hints at a strategic goal of reinforcing black's central presence and perhaps preparing for a queenside expansion or a slow positional buildup. rather than immediate tactical skirmishes. Opening a path for the queen and potentially reinforcing the kingside pawn structure is the aim of this maneuver, although it momentarily concedes central space and invites a kingside pawn storm if black isn't careful. Consolidating the knight on a more central square after the exchange, aiming to support a future kingside advance or simply improve its position out of immediate danger. Repositioning the knight to d3 aims to reinforce the central pawn chain and prepare for a potential kingside expansion, potentially opening lines against black's castled position. This knight maneuver, while seemingly passive at first glance, is a subtle yet powerful positional adjustment. White seeks to create a more robust pawn structure and gain flexibility. The knight's new outpost on d3 will contribute to controlling key central squares, particularly d4 and e5, while also offering support for a future e4-e5 pawn push if the opportunity arises. It also frees up the f3 square for potential future pieces and discourages black's knight from easily infiltrating on f5. This is a patient approach, focusing on gradual improvement and setting the stage for a more decisive action later in the game. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, black aggressively challenges white's central grip and aims to shatter the pawn shield protecting the enemy king. Opening the e-file promises immediate pressure, forcing black to confront the sudden aggression and potentially weaken their castled position. This capture strategically unlocks the g-file for your rook and pawn storm, creating immediate dynamic imbalances and forcing white to defend a suddenly exposed king. Opening up the f-file for your rook and creating a potential outpost on f5 while simultaneously putting pressure on black's d6 pawn is a bold commitment of the pawn structure, signaling an aggressive intent to disrupt black's carefully built fianchetto setup and create weaknesses around the kingside. This move is a determined effort to bring the knight back into the game and contest the kingside, a wise decision given the pawn structure's rigidity after white's central pawn push and f4 push. The knight aims to find an active square, perhaps f4 or h4, to put pressure on white's king's defenses, which are starting to look a little exposed after the e-pawn's advance and the f-pawn's capture. It's crucial to activate these less developed pieces before white's own pieces achieve greater coordination. Aimed at controlling the e-file and creating potential mating threats, this maneuver boldly repositions the queen, surveying the board from a more active central hub while simultaneously reinforcing the e4 pawn's defense against black's nascent kingside pressure, thereby setting the stage for further queenside expansion or a central pawn push. Sensing an opportune moment to bolster the queenside and prepare for potential pawn breaks, black strategically repositions the rook to the more active e-file, simultaneously clearing the path for further piece development and reinforcing the center. Opening the f-file with this exchange abruptly reshapes the central pawn structure, creating immediate tactical possibilities and demanding sharp play from both sides. Embracing the central tension, black boldly recaptures, opening lines and challenging white's pawn structure while simultaneously preparing to activate the neglected knight. Unlocking the d-file opens avenues for white's rook, but be mindful of the potential for black's queen to become active on that same line, creating dynamic counterplay. Re-establishing the rook on an open file immediately, this allows black to contest the vital central files and prepare for potential pawn advances while also bolstering the king's defense. Sharpening the attack on black's queenside, this knight jump aims to create an immediate fork threat on c7, while simultaneously asserting influence over the crucial light squares. Black's bishop finds a more active diagonal, eyeing the queenside and potentially supporting a kingside counterplay while reinforcing the pawn chain. Bringing the bishop to d3 aims to bolster the kingside defense, preparing for potential pawn pushes or simply improving piece coordination by freeing up the knight on c3. It also subtly discourages black's knight from further infiltration via e4, while simultaneously looking to exploit the weak d5 pawn if white can sufficiently reinforce it. Opening up the a-file in this manner significantly alters the positional landscape, exchanging a solid bishop for a knight that had become somewhat passive on b5. It's a strategic gambit that aims to create dynamic possibilities, even if it temporarily weakens the pawn structure around your king. Opening the c-file is a crucial decision, creating a direct pathway for your rook to participate in the game and potentially pressure black's queenside. This pawn push fundamentally alters the pawn structure, aiming to exploit the now open lines and potentially create weaknesses in the enemy camp. It's a proactive step to seize the initiative. Seeking to consolidate the queenside pawn structure and prepare a potential kingside advance, black repositions the queen to a more active square. Shifting the queen to f2 aims to improve its coordination with the knight on b5, putting pressure on the e5 pawn and indirectly on the weakened c-file, potentially preparing for a central pawn push or an assault on the kingside. Black aggressively pushes the pawn, attempting to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and open a path for the knight, though it leaves the king somewhat exposed. Sacrificing the bishop to pry open the kingside, this action aims to disrupt black's developing harmony and exploit any lingering weaknesses around the monarch, even if it means giving up material. Opening up the h-file introduces a dynamic element, but it also exposes your king to potential diagonal threats from white's bishop, especially considering the weakened dark squares around your monarch. The immediate recapture of the pawn unleashes white's queen, repositioning it to a central square where it exerts pressure and eyes weaknesses in black's pawn structure, particularly the isolated f-pawn, while also preparing potential advances on the kingside. Prying open the e-file presents a tantalizing opportunity for counterplay, as the rook now stands poised to exploit the open avenue toward white's quiescent king. Opening the central file allows white to finally bring their rook into the fight, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside pawns black has created. The central pawn structure is now shattered, opening up lines for both sides, but black's immediate goal seems to be unifying their rooks and eyeing the kingside. Reinforcing the kingside structure and preparing to contest the open files is the immediate goal, but be mindful of the potential for black to centralize their pieces and exploit the weakened pawn shield around your monarch. This ambitious rook sacrifice aims to create immediate chaos and disrupt white's queenside structure, forcing a reaction and potentially opening lines towards the white king. Preserving the threatened rook is a sensible, albeit passive, reaction, aiming to consolidate material balance rather than directly challenging black's initiative on the open files. Repositioning the rook to the fourth rank, creating a potent blockade and potentially preparing a dangerous infiltration along the open files, this maneuver injects fresh life into black's initiative. Recapturing on f2 with the queen is a crucial decision, aiming to centralize your attack and prevent any immediate counterplay on the kingside. White is attempting to consolidate their position after a series of exchanges, seeking to exploit black's slightly exposed king and potentially create weaknesses on the dark squares. The queen's presence here supports the pawn push f4 and offers some protection to the kingside. It also creates a battery with the rook on d2, eyeing the 8th rank. This move signals a shift from tactical skirmishing to a more positional struggle, where precise piece placement will be paramount. Sharpening the endgame transition, black aims to activate the queenside pawns and pressure white's d5 outpost, potentially creating a passed pawn in the future while restricting white's piece mobility. Consolidating a precarious pawn chain on the queenside, this maneuver seeks to shore up the vulnerable pawn and prepare for potential queenside expansion, while subtly hinting at a possible future repositioning of the knight. Re-establishing pressure along the 8th rank, the rook aims to dislodge white's dominant knight and activate the queen's defense while eyeing potential breakthroughs. Unleashing a potent threat against the black king, this queen sacrifice aims to dismantle the pawn shield and exploit the exposed monarch, potentially forcing concessions or a swift checkmate. Swapping queens here signals a clear intention to transition into an endgame, aiming to exploit the slight structural advantages that might emerge. It simplifies the complex tactical landscape considerably, forcing a reevaluation of piece placement and pawn structures, potentially opening up avenues for the rooks on the open files once the central tension dissipates. The king's pawn storm is finally blunted, as white consolidates control over the open d-file, preparing to mobilize the remaining pieces and exert pressure on black's slightly exposed monarch in the ensuing endgame. Finally, the king ventures out from its protective shell, seeking activity and perhaps some breathing room in this now open landscape. Restoring the rook to its active initial posting on the f-file allows white to press the advantage along this crucial open column, potentially preparing for a more coordinated assault on black's somewhat exposed king. Unleashing the monarch from its defensive cage, this maneuver seeks to activate the king, transforming it from a static target into a potential piece in the endgame's unfolding drama, eyeing the potentially weak h-pawn structure. Securing the monarch's escape route by clearing the alleyway to the corner is a prudent step, preventing any immediate unpleasantness from the advancing black pawns, and preparing the king for a potential shift towards the center as the endgame approaches. Challenging the entrenched pawn structure on the queen side with this rook maneuver, black boldly seeks to unravel the position and activate their misplaced pieces, aiming to disrupt white's comfortable setup and create play on the now open queen side. Opening the c-file for infiltration, white aims to destabilize black's defensive structure. Swapping off the active rook streamlines the pawn structure, aiming to activate the king and potentially exploit the now open c-file for the remaining rook. Opening the crucial c-file for potential infiltration, white aims to exploit the weakened pawn structure around black's monarch and create new avenues for attack. Relinquishing the central rook gives up crucial attacking pressure, but the remaining pawns on the queen side might offer some counterplay. Pressing the pawn forward aims to create space on the queen side and potentially launch a pawn storm or restrict black's pieces, though it also weakens the b4 square. Opening up the d-file offers a potential pathway for the rook to become more active on the queen side, aiming to pressure white's isolated pawn structure or perhaps find a new outpost if the queenside play develops. Fortifying the queenside pawn structure with this advance prepares to contest the file and potentially create a passed pawn later on. The rook's repositioning to the third rank initiates a bold pawn thrust, aiming to unravel the kingside and potentially create an isolated passed pawn. Seizing control of the open file, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and infiltrate the enemy position. Seizing the open file, black aims to exploit white's compromised pawn structure and open lines around the monarch, seeking counterplay through aggressive pawn advancement and potential infiltration. Seizing the open file with the rook is a natural instinct, and while it gains immediate material, it overlooks the looming danger of black's connected passed pawns. Securing the isolated passed pawn with a determined advance is a crucial decision, aiming to advance it further and create significant winning chances in the endgame. Challenging the doubled pawns presents a new dimension of endgame complexity. The rook embarks on a daring journey to the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create passed pawns or even a passed rook later on. Capitalizing on black's dispersed pawns, the rook secures the crucial 7th rank, establishing a strong outpost that will severely restrict the enemy king's mobility and pave the way for pawn advances. The rook ventures onto an open file, a proactive stance that seeks to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially penetrate the queenside. Seizing the now open file, white aims to infiltrate black's weakened queenside, potentially menacing further pawns and creating endgame advantages. The rook's infiltration onto the 7th rank now poses a significant threat, aiming to disrupt the pawn structure and create avenues for further attack. The king's sudden migration towards the center offers a glimmer of hope for activity, aiming to participate in the pawn race before black's advanced soldiers become truly unstoppable. The rook abandons the newly created queenside pawn majority, heading towards the kingside where its presence might disrupt white's remaining pawns and offer some attacking potential. A timely repositioning of the rook to the 8th rank, now that the pawn structure has been simplified, creates an immediate threat to any stray black pieces and prepares to contest the open file. A bold gambit to awaken the endgame, snatching a pawn while simultaneously creating a menacing outpost for the rook, though it leaves the king slightly exposed to potential checks on the open files. The king ventures out to exploit the open files and potentially harass black's pawns. The king's newfound freedom across the board presents an intriguing tactical canvas, forcing a reassessment of piece placement and potential infiltrations. The king boldly advances, seeking to engage in the endgame's crucial skirmishes. Initiating a pawn race to the promotion square, black sacrifices immediate pressure for a clear path to victory. The white king awkwardly sidesteps the impending check, a temporary reprieve that sacrifices any hope of regaining material advantage. Analysis asterisk. This endgame is a classic illustration of how pawn structure and king activity dictate the outcome. Black's connected passed pawns on the queen side, coupled with white's compromised king position, make this a losing battle for white. The opening saw a sharp king's Indian defense, but white's aggressive but ultimately flawed pawn push on move 15, followed by exchanges that simplified the position unfavorably, led to this situation. Black has successfully converted their positional advantage into a material and positional edge. White's king being forced to the edge of the board is a significant weakness, allowing black's king to penetrate and support their pawns. The capture of the bishop on d3 was a critical moment, allowing black to gain an unstoppable passed pawn. Even with the queens off the board, the remaining pieces and pawns create a dynamic where black's advanced pawns are simply too powerful. White's best hope would have been to coordinate their remaining forces for a desperate defense, but the current king placement makes that nearly impossible. The pawn on d3 is now a formidable force, and white's king is too exposed to stop it from advancing. The black king, despite its apparent safety behind pawns, now finds itself exposed as the d-pawn advances, potentially creating passed pawn threats or distracting white's pieces. The rook steps forward, aiming to disrupt black's well-entrenched pawn majority and create its own winning chances by exploiting the exposed king. The black king, no longer safely tucked away behind pawns, now bravely ventures into the center, a bold gambit to support the advancing passed pawn. The king, liberated from its defensive duties, embarks on a crucial journey to the queen side, aiming to support the advance of the pawns. Shifting the king towards the center, black proactively seeks safer squares and aims to connect the rooks, preparing for a more active role in the ensuing endgame where pawn structure and king activity will dictate the outcome. Solidifying the pawn structure on the king side, a welcome change after the preceding exchanges. Unveiling a surprise thrust, this maneuver aims to exploit the newfound open diagonal leading towards white's monarch. The king ventures out, embracing a new role as active participant in the endgame's final skirmishes, aiming to bolster its pawn's advance. The monarch scrambles for a safer haven as the pawn advance continues, forcing a king repositioning to evade further checks and maintain any semblance of defensive structure. King consolidation is key now, positioning the monarch on a safer square to oversee the remaining pawn structure. Black's recapture on g3 activates the rook and potentially reestablishes an attacking presence, but it also leaves the pawn structure on the king side somewhat compromised for the long haul. The king's central escape route, opened by black's pawn advances, is now a glaring weakness that your rook can exploit, aiming to shepherd the king to safety and perhaps force a draw by perpetual check. The black monarch bravely steps into the open, seeking a safer haven from the attacking rook and pawn on the queen side, a necessary gamble given the pressure building. Repositioning the rook to the edge of the board opens up a crucial 7th rank for potential activity and prepares to support the central pawn advance. Hoping to create a passed pawn on the king side by sacrificing the material, black now has to worry about the connected passers white aims to create on the queen side. Opening up a pathway for the rook to become an active participant in the attack on the d-pawn. The black king, now exposed, faces immense pressure as the rook on the 7th rank seizes a decisive outpost, a stark reminder of the king's vulnerable position throughout this endgame. Initiating a controlled descent towards the king side, this king's repositioning aims to secure remaining pawn potential and support a future assault on the queen side majority, transforming the endgame from a passive defense into an active struggle for the initiative. The black rook, having cornered the opponent's monarch, now orchestrates a final dance of check with its companion, aiming to dismantle any remaining defensive fortifications and usher in an inevitable victory. Piloting the king to this square creates a dual threat, aiming to trap the opposing rook and simultaneously offer a strategic retreat should the pawn push forward. The black king, having finally escaped its initial confines, now finds itself in a perilous chase to achieve a safe haven as white's rook actively hunts it across the board. The monarch's safety becomes paramount as the opposition is drawn into a forcing endgame sequence. The g-pawn's advance creates a new outpost for the monarch, a slight positional sacrifice to bolster the king's defenses against any potential infiltration through the now open h-file. The king scurries towards the queenside safety, a desperate attempt to escape the relentless pressure building on the kingside. The black rook, having completed its sortie across the board, now finds a stable outpost on the first rank, a crucial pivot point for potential future maneuvers. The white king ventures boldly into enemy territory, seeking to support the advanced pawns and perhaps even join the attack on the isolated black rook, a risky but potentially decisive maneuver aiming to create winning endgame chances.